Foster kids, what's the worst family you were ever placed with? My foster parents sold me to their neighbors for money and told everyone I ran away. But when I escaped and went to the police, they didn't believe me because the whole neighborhood was involved in a trafficking ring. I was 13 when I was placed with the Hendersons, and they seemed perfect on paper. Clean house, stable income, glowing references from other foster children they'd helped. Mrs. Henderson was a Sunday school teacher, and Mr. Henderson coached Little League Baseball. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. My caseworker, Ms. Rodriguez, was so relieved to find them. I'd been through 6 placements in 2 years, and she was running out of options. "This is going to be different, Emma," she promised as we pulled into their driveway. "The Hendersons are special people. They've helped dozens of kids over the years." The house was beautiful, with a white picket fence and flowers in the front yard. Mrs. Henderson greeted us at the door wearing an apron, flour on her hands from baking cookies. She was probably in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled. "Emma, sweetheart," she said, pulling me into a hug. "Welcome home." Mr. Henderson appeared behind her, tall and broad-shouldered with a mustache. He shook my hand firmly and asked about my interests. When I mentioned that I liked to read, his face lit up. "We have a whole library upstairs," he said. "You can read as much as you want here." The first few weeks were wonderful. I had my own room with a window seat and bookshelves. Mrs. Henderson cooked amazing meals and packed lunches for school. Mr. Henderson helped me with homework and taught me to play chess. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The neighbors were friendly too. The Johnsons next door had twin boys my age who included me in their games. Mrs. Walsh across the street always waved when she saw me walking to school. Mr. Martinez from down the block would stop by to chat with Mr. Henderson about sports. "You've really landed in a good place," Ms. Rodriguez said during one of her monthly visits. "The Hendersons speak so highly of you." But after about 6 weeks, things started to change. Small things at first. Mrs. Henderson would forget to wake me up for school, then act surprised when I overslept. Mr. Henderson stopped helping with homework, saying I needed to be more independent. "You're not a guest anymore," Mrs. Henderson explained when I asked about it. "You're part of the family now, and family members have responsibilities." The responsibilities started simple: doing dishes, folding laundry, keeping my room clean, but gradually they expanded. I was expected to cook breakfast every morning, clean the entire house on weekends, and do the grocery shopping after school. "Foster kids need structure," Mr. Henderson said when I complained about being tired. "We're teaching you valuable life skills." When I mentioned this to Ms. Rodriguez during her next visit, she nodded approvingly. "It's good that they're giving you responsibilities. That's what good families do." But the responsibilities kept growing. I was staying up until midnight doing housework, then getting up at 5 a.m. to start breakfast. My grades began to slip because I was too exhausted to focus in class. "Maybe you should spend less time reading and more time contributing to the household," Mrs. Henderson suggested when I fell asleep at the dinner table. By month 3, I was essentially running the household. Cooking, cleaning, shopping, even paying bills with the grocery money they gave me. The Hendersons had friends over frequently, and I was expected to serve them drinks and clean up afterward. "Emma's such a helper," Mrs. Henderson would say to her guests. "We're so lucky to have her." I started to notice that some of the guests looked at me strangely. Long stares, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Mr. Martinez seemed especially interested in me, asking personal questions about my background and how I liked living with the Hendersons. "You're growing up so fast," he said one evening after dinner. "Such a pretty girl." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. It was around this time that the Hendersons started having special friends over more frequently. Always adults, always in the evening, always when I was doing housework. They'd gather in the living room while I cleaned the kitchen, their voices low and serious. "Emma," Mrs. Henderson called one night, "come say hello to our guests." I walked into the living room to find 5 adults sitting around the coffee table. The Johnsons from next door, Mrs. Walsh from across the street, Mr. Martinez, and a man I didn't recognize. "This is Emma," Mr. Henderson said, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "She's been such a blessing to our family." The strangers looked me up and down like I was a piece of merchandise. The unknown man smiled in a way that made my stomach turn. "Beautiful girl," he said, very mature for her age. "Thank you," I mumbled, trying to back away, but Mr. Henderson's grip tightened. "Why don't you sit with us for a while?" Mrs. Henderson suggested. "Get to know our friends." I sat on the edge of the couch, every instinct screaming at me to run. The conversation was strange, full of coded language and meaningful glances. They talked about opportunities and arrangements and mutual benefits. "Emma's been with us for 4 months now," Mr. Henderson said. "She's really settled in. And she's so responsible," Mrs. Walsh added. "Such a good worker." The unknown man nodded approvingly. "I can see that. She seems very compliant." I excused myself as soon as I could, claiming I had homework to do. But I couldn't concentrate on anything except the sick feeling in my stomach. Something was very wrong here, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The next day at school, I tried to talk to my guidance counselor, Mrs. Chen. But when I started to explain that something felt off at the Hendersons, she cut me off. "Emma, you've been through 6 places placements in 2 years. At some point, you need to accept that the problem might be with you, not with the families trying to help you. I left her office feeling more alone than ever. If the adults whose job it was to protect me wouldn't listen, who would? That weekend, the Hendersons announced they were going away for the night. A romantic getaway, they said. I'd be staying with the Johnsons. Just for one night, Mrs. Henderson said. The Johnsons have offered to look after you. But when I went next door, Mrs. Johnson seemed nervous. She kept checking her watch and glancing out the window. Emma, sweetheart, she said around 8 p.m. I need to step out for a few minutes. You'll be fine here with the boys, right? She left before I could answer. The Johnson twins, who were usually friendly, seemed different too. They kept whispering to each other and avoiding eye contact with me. Around 10 p.m., Mrs. Johnson came back with Mr. Martinez. They both looked serious. Emma, Mr. Martinez said, sitting down across from me, we need to talk. He explained that the Hendersons had asked him to look after me for the evening, to make sure I was comfortable and had everything I needed. I'll be staying here tonight, he said, just to keep an eye on things. Every alarm bell in my head was ringing. I made an excuse about being tired and went to the guest room, but I didn't sleep. I could hear Mr. Martinez and Mrs. Johnson talking in low voices downstairs. Around midnight, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Someone tried the door handle to my room. When they found it locked, they knocked softly. Emma, it's Mr. Martinez. I just wanted to check on you. I didn't answer. I barely breathed. Emma, open the door. We need to talk. I stayed silent, pressed against the wall behind the bed. After what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated. The next morning, Mrs. Johnson acted like nothing had happened. She made breakfast and chatted normally about the weather, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided looking at me directly. When the Hendersons returned, they seemed different too. More businesslike, less warm. Mr. Henderson asked how my night had been with an intensity that felt wrong. Fine, I said. Everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. Over the next few days, I noticed more strange behavior. Hushed phone conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Visitors who would arrive after I went to bed and leave before I woke up. One night, I heard voices in the backyard. Peering through my bedroom window, I saw Mr. Henderson talking to two men I didn't recognize. They were looking up at my window, pointing and nodding. She's ready, I heard Mr. Henderson say. Ready for what? The answer came the following Friday. Mrs. Henderson told me I'd be staying with Mrs. Walsh for the weekend while they attended a family funeral. Mrs. Walsh is looking forward to having you, she said. She's prepared a nice room for you. But Mrs. Walsh's house felt different from the Johnsons. Colder, more clinical. She showed me to a basement room with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. You'll be comfortable here, she said. I'll bring you meals. Why is the door locked? I asked. For your safety, she replied. We wouldn't want you to get confused in the dark and hurt yourself. That night, I heard voices upstairs. Multiple men talking and laughing. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to understand what was happening. Such a pretty girl. Worth every penny. Hendersons did good work. My blood ran cold. They were talking about me like I was a product they'd purchased. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Mrs. Walsh appeared with a tray of food, but she wasn't alone. The man from the Hendersons' living room was with her. Hello, Emma, he said, his voice sickeningly sweet. I'm Mr. Davis. I've been looking forward to meeting you properly. I backed against the wall. I want to go back to the Hendersons. Oh, but you're not going back, Mrs. Walsh said. You're going to stay here with Mr. Davis. He's going to take very good care of you. Mr. Davis stepped into the room. Now, Emma, I know this is all new and scary, but if you're a good girl, everything will be fine. But if you cause problems. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That's when I understood. The Hendersons hadn't been fostering me out of kindness. They'd been grooming me, preparing me to be sold to whoever would pay the most. And the whole neighborhood was involved. Please, I whispered. I just want to go home. This is your home now, Mr. Davis said. I paid good money for you, and I expect to get my money's worth. Mrs. Walsh left us alone. Mr. Davis sat on the bed and patted the space beside him. Come here, Emma. Let's get to know each other. I shook my head, pressing harder against the wall. His friendly demeanor dropped instantly. I said, come here. Now. When I still didn't move, he stood up and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward him. That's when my survival instincts kicked in. I bit him as hard as I could, tasting blood. He screamed and let go, and I ran for the door. It was still open, and I bolted up the stairs. Mrs. Walsh was in the kitchen washing dishes. She looked up in surprise as I ran past her toward the front door. Emma, come back here! But I was already outside, running down the street in my pajamas. I didn't stop until I reached the police station 3 miles away. Please, I gasped to the officer at the front desk. I need help. People are trying to hurt me. The officer, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, led me to a small room and gave me a blanket and some water. Slow down, he said. Tell me what happened. I told him everything. The Hendersons, the strange visitors, being sold to Mr. Davis. How the whole neighborhood seemed to be involved. But as I talked, I could see the skepticism growing in his eyes. These are serious accusations, he said, but the Hendersons are well-respected members of the community. Mr. Henderson coaches Little League. Mrs. Henderson teaches Sunday school. They're lying, I insisted. They're all lying. They bought me like I was property. The officer sighed. Emma, I understand you've been through a lot of foster homes. Sometimes kids act out when they're scared or confused. I'm not acting out, I'm telling the truth. But I could see he didn't believe me. He made some phone calls, and within an hour, the Hendersons arrived at the station. They looked distraught, worried parents whose troubled foster daughter had run away. Thank God you found her, Mrs. Henderson said, tears in her eyes. We were so worried. She's been having some behavioral issues, Mr. Henderson explained to the officer. Our caseworker warned us this might happen. She has a history of running away. I stared at them in disbelief. They were so convincing, so genuinely concerned. If I hadn't lived through what I'd lived through, I might have believed them myself. Emma, the officer said gently, these people are here to take you home. Why don't you go with them and we'll forget this whole incident? No, I said, backing away. I won't go with them. They're going to hurt me. The officer looked at the Hendersons sympathetically. Has she been evaluated for mental health issues? We've been considering it, Mrs. Henderson said sadly, but we hoped love and patience would be enough. Please, I begged. Just check Mrs. Walsh's basement. Look for the room with no windows. Look for evidence. The officer made a note. We'll look into it, but for now, you need to go home with your foster parents. I was trapped. The system that was supposed to protect me was delivering me back to the people who wanted to harm me. The ride back to the Hendersons' house was silent, but I could feel the anger radiating from both of them. I'd embarrassed them, caused problems, threatened their operation. You've been very bad, Emma, Mrs. Henderson said as we pulled into the driveway. Very, very bad. We're going to have to be more careful with you, Mr. Henderson added. Can't have you running around making up stories. They led me inside, but instead of taking me to my room, they headed for the basement. I'd never been down there before, but now I could see why. It was set up like a prison, with multiple rooms with locks on the outside. This is where disobedient girls go, Mrs. Henderson said, opening one of the doors, until they learn to behave. The room was tiny, with a mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner. No windows, no light switch, just a bare bulb that Mrs. Henderson controlled from outside. Please, I said. I'll be good. I won't run away again. Too late for that, Mr. Henderson said. You've shown us we can't trust you. They locked me in the room and left me in darkness. I could hear them talking upstairs, making phone calls, rearranging their plans. Have to move faster now. Police might start asking questions. Get rid of her before she causes more problems. I realized then that I wasn't just being punished. I was being prepared for something worse. They were going to sell me again, but this time to someone who wouldn't care if I was willing or not. I spent 3 days in that basement room, let out only to use the bathroom and eat 1 meal a day. On the third night, I heard voices upstairs again. New voices, unfamiliar ones. Perfect age, completely broken in, no more running. Then footsteps on the basement stairs. Mrs. Henderson appeared with 2 men I'd never seen before. They were rough-looking, with cold eyes and calloused hands. This is her, Mrs. Henderson said. She's been a bit difficult, but nothing you can't handle. One of the men stepped into the room and looked me up and down like I was livestock. She's skinny, he said, and she looks scared. That's easily fixed, the other man replied. Fear makes them more compliant. The price includes transport, Mrs. Henderson said. You'll never see her again. They were selling me to people who would take me far away, where no one would ever find me. This was my last chance. When the first man reached for me, I acted like I was too weak to resist. I let him pick me up, waited until he was carrying me up the stairs. Then I grabbed a handful of his hair and yanked as hard as I could while screaming at the top of my lungs. He dropped me and I rolled down the stairs, but I kept screaming. The noise was incredible in the small space, echoing off the walls. Shut her up, Mrs. Henderson hissed. But I wouldn't shut up. I screamed and screamed until my throat was raw, until I heard something that made my heart leap. Sirens. The police had come back to check on me, just as the officer had promised. My screaming had alerted them that something was wrong. Police, open up! The 2 men bolted for the back door, but more sirens were coming from that direction too. The Hendersons looked panicked, whispering urgently to each other. Emma's having another episode, Mrs. Henderson called out. She's been having nightmares. But the officers didn't buy it this time. They demanded to search the house, and when they found me in the basement with 2 strange men, everything clicked into place. You're under arrest, the lead officer told the Hendersons. You have the right to remain silent. It took weeks for the full scope of the operation to come out. The Hendersons hadn't just been selling me, they'd been running a foster care trafficking ring for years. They'd take in troubled kids, isolate them from their caseworkers, and then sell them to buyers across the country. The neighbors weren't just complicit, they were customers. Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Martinez, the Johnsons, even some of the other foster families in the area, they'd all been buying and selling children like commodities. We estimate they trafficked over 30 children over the past decade, Detective Silva explained to me during one of our interviews. You were brave to fight back. Most kids were too scared or too broken to resist. The trial was a circus. The Hendersons tried to claim they were just providing troubled children with discipline and structure. Their lawyers painted me as a disturbed teenager who'd made up stories for attention, but the evidence was overwhelming. The basement rooms, the financial records, the testimonies from other survivors who came forward after my story went public. The defendants operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise, the prosecutor told the jury. They preyed on the most vulnerable members of our society, children who had no one to protect them. Mrs. Henderson got 25 years to life. Mr. Henderson got 30 years. The buyers and neighbors received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. But the damage was done. Dozens of children had been sold, abused, and traumatized. Some were found and rescued, but others had disappeared completely, lost in a system that had failed them. I spent the rest of my teenage years in a group home, working with therapists and slowly learning to trust again. It wasn't easy. I had nightmares for years, panic attacks whenever I heard footsteps in the hallway, but I also had something the Hendersons never expected me to have: a voice. I testified before Congress about the failures in the foster care system. I spoke at conferences about trafficking and exploitation. I made sure that other kids would have protections I didn't have. You saved lives, Ms. Rodriguez told me years later. Your courage to speak up led to reforms that have protected thousands of children. The foster care system changed because of my case. New protocols for vetting foster families, better training for caseworkers, more frequent unannounced visits. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. I aged out of the system at 18 and used my victim compensation money to go to college. I studied social work, wanting to help kids like me who had nowhere else to turn. During my junior year, I got a letter from Mrs. Henderson in prison. She claimed she'd found God and wanted to apologize. She said she'd been desperate for money and had made terrible choices. I threw the letter away without reading it all. Some apologies don't deserve acceptance. After graduation, I got a job with Child Protective Services. My first case was a 12-year-old girl who'd been through multiple foster homes and was acting out at school. She's probably just trying to get attention, her caseworker said. Some kids make up stories when they're not getting enough focus. But I recognized the signs: the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched when adults touched her, the detailed stories that were too specific to be lies. I believe you, I told her, and tell me what happened. She broke down crying, then told me about her foster father who'd been selling her to his friends. It was the Hendersons all over again, but this time the system was ready to listen. The foster father was arrested within 24 hours. The girl was placed in a secure facility while we investigated. 3 other children came forward with similar stories. How did you know? My supervisor asked. Because I lived it, I said. And I swore I'd never let it happen to anyone else. Over the years, I've worked hundreds of cases. Some are false alarms, kids who are genuinely troubled but not being abused. But others are real, and each time I help a child escape a situation like mine, I feel like I'm honoring all the kids who didn't make it out. I never married, never had children of my own. My work is my family now. The kids I've helped, the families I've reunited, the predators I've helped put away. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't fought back that night in Mrs. Walsh's basement. If I'd been compliant, if I'd accepted my fate, I would have disappeared into the trafficking network, become another statistic, but I didn't disappear. I survived, and I made sure my voice was heard. The Hendersons thought they were buying and selling a powerless child. Instead, they'd created their own worst nightmare: a survivor who would dedicate her life to stopping people like them. On the 20th anniversary of my rescue, I got a letter from one of the other survivors. She was now a teacher with 3 children of her own. I wanted to thank you, she wrote. You showed me that we didn't have to be victims forever, that we could take our pain and turn it into purpose. That's exactly what I'd done. The Hendersons had tried to rob me of my future, but instead, they'd given me a mission. Every child I helped, every trafficking ring I exposed, every predator I helped convict was proof that their evil hadn't won. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the thing that defines your purpose. The Hendersons thought they were destroying a helpless foster kid. Instead, they'd created someone who would spend her life making sure no other child would suffer what I suffered, and that in the end was justice.